Hi, boys and girls. Today we're starting with chapter 23, titled The Rifle. Now, in case you didn't remember, last time there was an attack on Annabelle the cow by the wolves, and Roz helped to get the wolves off of Annabelle. So today we're going to again start with chapter 23, titled The Rifle. The wolves returned the very next morning. Shortly after dawn, they leaped from the trees and started chasing a poor calf through the pasture. Roz managed to drive them off, but that night they returned again. The herd came stampeding into the barn as the wolves laughed and trotted back to the fields. The cows were in shock. They refused to leave the barn. If this continued, the herd would produce less milk and the farm would lose money. And Mr. Sharif would send Roz back to the factory. Ooh. Something had to be done. Knock, knock, knock. The dog barked and the children opened the door. How'd you get all those scrapes? said Jaya. Is everything okay? Said Jad. I must speak with your father, said Roz. Mr. Sharif came to the door and Roz explained the problem. At the first mention of wolves, he sent his children to their rooms, but the dog stayed. Oscar had no idea what the man and the robot were discussing, and his tail happily wagged as he stood beside them. However, his tail stopped wagging when Mr. Sharif handed Roz a rifle. Wow. The dog had seen the rifle in action, and it frightened him to the core. He scurried into the bushes and hid there, whimpering, while the conversation went on. What do you mean you can't fire a rifle? The man yelled. Roz, you're a farmer now, and sometimes farmers have to kill animals. It was the first time Mr. Sharif had ever yelled at Roz. She waited patiently as words and spittle flew from his mouth. My farm and my family are in danger. Roz, I order you to kill those wolves. I cannot follow that order because I am not programmed to be violent. Mr. Sharif let out a heavy sigh. He knew Roz was right, but when he reached for the weapon, she wouldn't let go. The man stared at the robot stared at the dog, and the dog stared at the rifle. Oscar was still whimpering and hiding in the bushes. Just the sight of the rifle had sent him into a panic. It was hard to believe that such a fearful animal was related to wolves, but dogs are related to wolves, thought the robot, and her computer brain began buzzing with activity. She thought of the dogs and wolves and rifles. She thought of Shadow, the wolf leader, and the long, straight scar on his side. And then she had an idea. Although I cannot fire the rifle, said Roz, I believe it can help me solve the wolf problem. Mr. Sharif frowned. He didn't know what the robot was getting at, but he was happy to let her handle the wolves by herself. Fine, try it your way, he said. Just don't lose any cows, or else we might have to lose a robot, too. Ooh, yikes. Chapter 24. The Bluff. The cows peered out from the barn at Roz. The robot was holding the rifle. She carried it to the far side of the pasture and placed it by her feet. Then she began coating herself with mud and grass, and probably a little cow dung. When every inch of her body was concealed, she nestled down into the ground and became a part of the landscape, an ordinary clump of grass. So, boys and girls, you have to take a look at Roz now. The cows were stunned. What's Roz doing? Is she all right? Where does she go? Where did she go? Roz had learned to camouflage herself back on the island, and now she was using that trick once again. She sat motionless for hours, waiting for the wolves to appear. Daylight faded. The stars came out. The moon climbed into the sky, but the wolves didn't show. So Roz tried something new. The robot was an excellent mimic, and she began crying out in the sad voice of a wounded calf. Please help me, she cried. I have hurt my leg and I cannot move. Crickets chirped. Please help me. An owl hooted. I cannot move. The calf's voice continued crying out. Finally, as the moon dipped behind the trees, 7 wolves slunk into the pasture. Shadow led the way, silently stalking through the night. Covered in dark fur, he was practically invisible. Only his long, pale scar gave him away. Noses sniffed, eyes searched, ears listened. Then a clump of grass began rustling. There, whispered Shadow. The calf is hiding in that tall grass. Boys and girls, is it really the calf? Something feels wrong to me, Shadow, said a female wolf. This is too easy. I make the decisions, Barb, snapped the wolf leader. Slash, lurk, fang. Circle around and wait for my signal. 3 wolves dashed off. When they were in position, Shadow gave the signal and his pack closed in on the wounded calf. With each step, the grass rustled more and more until the ground seemed to be moving. And then the ground really was moving. Grass and dirt crumbled aside, and there was the robot standing tall, pointing the rifle at the wolf leader. The pack froze. Hello, Shadow, growled the robot. My name is Roz. I see from your scar that you are familiar with rifles. You have been shot at before. You know what will happen if I pull this trigger. Reader, you and I are well aware that our robot was not programmed to be violent. Roz couldn't have pulled the trigger if she wanted to, but she didn't want to. She couldn't have pulled the trigger if she wanted to, but she didn't want to. She was bluffing. Of course, Shadow didn't know any of this. As far as the wolf knew, he was defeated. And so he did what wolves do when they're defeated. He lay down and he cowered before the robot. For the first time anyone could ever recall, the wolf leader looked weak. I do not want to hurt any wolves, Roz continued. But if you return to this farm, I will have no choice. Now please leave and never, ever come back. Shadow scrambled away with his tail between his legs. Barb was close behind him, followed by the other wolves, and soon the entire pack had disappeared into the night. So, boys and girls, it's called the bluff, because when you pretend to do something that you're not really capable of doing, that is called a bluff. Chapter 25, The Summer. Spring melted into summer, and the wolves were nowhere to be seen. Perhaps Roz had scared off the pack for good. Or perhaps the heat was keeping them away. You see, it was the hottest time of year on the farm. The sun was scorching, the fields were baking, the pond was drying up, and foul odors were floating all around the dairy. During dry spells, the farm's powerful sprayers were activated. Water shot out in long, misty arcs, and the land turned deeper shades of green. When the hay fields were lush and ready to be harvested, Roz fired up the mower and the baler. The giant machines rolled out of the shed and down the long driveway. Shortly afterward, they rolled back in, leaving bales of hay strewn across the stubby fields. The cows and the humans spent hot days indoors. Only when the sun set and the air began to cool would they venture outside. The herd strolled out to graze under the stars. The children ran out to chase fireflies, and sometimes even Mr. Sharif stepped out to stretch his stiff legs. The trees swished in the evening breeze. Heat lightning flickered on the horizon. Cicadas sang their summer songs. When Roz wasn't farming, she was searching for a way to escape. Everything hinged on the children. The robot needed their help, but she just couldn't bring herself to tell them the truth. It was still too risky. Mr. Sharif asked the children not to distract Roz from her work, but they did it anyways. They'd sneak out from the house and order the robot to play with them. Together, they told stories, rode bicycles, lay in the grass watching fluffy clouds drift by. Summer was tornado season. On occasion, thick clouds would start funneling downward, reaching for the ground. So far, the funnel clouds had all receded back into the sky before doing any damage, but it was only a matter of time before a tornado actually touched down. Chapter 26 is titled The Tornado. The weather forecast warned of possible tornadoes that day, but despite their scientific equipment, experts still couldn't predict exactly when or where a tornado would strike. So most farmers carried on with their usual tasks while keeping a watchful eye on the skies. Roz was out in the fields, loading hay bales onto the flatbed truck. As towering puffy clouds rose up from the south, raindrops lightly tapped against her body, and she thought nothing of it. The wind began to blow, and still the robot continued with her work. It wasn't until the first flash of lightning that Roz finally called it quits. She climbed onto the back of the truck and automatically rolled the hayfield toward the driveway. And automatically rolled across the hayfield toward the driveway. The storm developed quickly. Dark clouds started swirling and bulging downward, lower and lower, like a giant twisting finger pointing at the countryside. A tornado was beginning to form. When the truck reached the driveway, Roz hollered, "Drive faster!" The engine revved, the tires kicked up. Gravel, and the robot held on tight. The funnel cloud continued stretching downward. It brushed the tree line, and leaves exploded into the air. Dust whirled around and around, rising higher with each spin. Then the tornado touched the ground. A siren sounded in the distance, but the tornado was growing noisier and angrier as it blew from the fields, and the siren was quickly lost to the howling winds. The truck charged up the driveway and into the cluster of farm buildings. Roz looked ahead at the house and saw frightened faces in the windows. "Go to the storm shelter," she hollered in her loudest voice. Then she leaped off the truck and ran to help the Sharifs. Leaves and sticks flew sideways, whipping against the robot's body, knocking her off balance. Behind her, the farm buildings rattled and groaned. The milking parlor was shaking violently. With a long, terrible screech, its entire roof peeled off and sailed away on the wind. 4 blurry shapes appeared in the backyard. Mr. Sharif shielded his face and hobbled alongside the house toward the storm shelter. He threw open the door and waved everyone down the stairs. Oscar went first, then Jaya. But Jad wasn't moving. "Come on, Jad," yelled his father. The boy stood still, shaggy hair flying everywhere, and stared up at the towering, twisting tornado. He used to have nightmares about tornadoes, but this was no nightmare. It was real. It was getting closer. The clouds swirled faster, and the wind roared louder. The trees bent down toward the ground. Jad suddenly felt strong arms around him, and Roz whisked him to safety. Mr. Sharif reached up from inside the shelter, desperately grasping for his son, and just when Roz thrust the boy into his father's arms, a blast of wind slammed the shelter door closed and swept our robot away. Boys and girls, I ask you to make a prediction. The family is in the shelter, but the robot just got swept away. What do you think will happen next? So now's your chance to make a prediction. I predict blank will happen next. Thank you for listening today. Can't wait to hear what you think. Bye, guys.